All right. Well, good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to the first event in the Spring 2024 virtual series of the City Talks on the theme of museums in the city, rethinking colonial urban pasts. My name is Ruben Rose Redwood, and I'm a professor of geography and the Associate Dean Academic in the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Victoria. And I'm also the chair of the UVic Committee for Urban Studies, which organizes the City Talks lecture series. I'd like to begin with a territory acknowledgement that we acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples, Songhees and Esquimalt, on whose territory the University of Victoria stands, and the Lekwungen and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. I would also like to acknowledge the support of the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Victoria for sponsoring the City Talks series. Now I'm joined tonight by my co-organizer, Denise Unsall, who is an assistant professor of communications and culture at Royal Roads University. Denise is a cultural anthropologist and a museum and heritage studies scholar, and she will discuss the theme for the Spring 2024 series of the City Talks a bit further, and then introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Coll Thrush. So I would like to thank you all for coming, and I'll now pass things over to Denise.
Good evening. Thank you, Ruben, for the introduction. Hello, my name is Denise Unsall, and I am working as an assistant professor at Royal Roads University, and I have been on these lands, ancestral lands of the Lekwungen family since 2015. My previous life, I was a teacher in Istanbul, teaching museums and heritage. So welcome tonight. The 2024 spring series of the City Talks is titled Museums in the City, Rethinking Colonial Urban Pasts. The talks in this series invites us to reflect on narratives and representations of urban colonial pasts and presents in museums and in city museums specifically. They give us an opportunity to discuss the role of the city museums as spaces of public culture, in placemaking, in narrating urban histories, in representing diverse identities and experiences. As you might know, today many museums go through a process of reconsidering and realigning their approach to history, to their communities, to those who have been excluded or included without agency or in different forms, redefining themselves in light of colonization, globalization, and migration. Now, I live in Victoria. There are several museums in this city. In addition to the provincial museum, there are smaller museums in historic heritage houses and buildings, and they tell and connect with a part of urban history. But there is not a museum of Victoria, like Vancouver or New Westminster or Surrey in BC. Should there be one? Should it be called a museum or Museum of Victoria? What and whose stories would it narrate? How and by whom? Now, this brings us to the narration of colonial urban histories in public places, public spaces like museums. We reached to Coll Thrush, who teaches on Indigenous and settler colonial histories at UBC, and his research and work emphasize place-based histories. His talk today centers on the parallel histories of Seattle, Victoria, and Vancouver. It cannot get more West Coast, focusing on the ways in which the processes of urban development dispossessed Indigenous peoples, but also the ways in which Indigenous communities have maintained connections to urban places. In his talk, these three cities illustrate how urban and Indigenous histories have been and still are deeply entangled with each other. Now, Coll's research is not specifically on museums or city museums, but it is in the same realm. And it invites us, his talk will invite us to reflect on the role and work of city museums in articulating a sense of place, telling the history of the place. A few words about our speaker then. Coll Thrush is professor of history, Killam teaching laureate, and faculty associate in critical Indigenous studies at the University of British Columbia. He's the author of Native Seattle, Histories from the Crossing Over Place, Indigenous London, Native Travelers at the Heart of Empire. His current research looks at the history of colonialism on the northwest coast of North America through the subject of shipwrecks in the so-called graveyard of the Pacific. And the title of his talk is Urban Colonialism on the Salish Sea, Tales from Three Cities. We will have a Q&A after his talk. So please welcome Coll Thrush.
Great, thank you, Denise and Ruben. Can you hear me all right? Great. Okay, thank you. It's always a bit, I still am not used to this whole virtual talking thing, so I'll do my best. And I'll warn you that my office lights will shut off at some point because I'm not moving enough, at which point I will flail about and the lights will come back on. So bear with me. Thanks for having me here. And I hope my talk today is helpful for really thinking about the context in which museums take place. The sort of broader landscapes around outside the doors of museums. I'll start with my own land acknowledgement, I suppose. I'm a settler of mixed European ancestry. I was raised in the treaty territory of the Muckleshoot Indian tribe, which is about an hour southeast of Seattle in Washington. And I live and work now on the traditional ancestral and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And I live about 6 blocks from the ancestral community of Sinnock, which I'll talk a little bit about later. And so I really come to this as a settler scholar who is interested in helping us think about how colonialism has worked historically and how we might dismantle it in the present, particularly as a historian around historical narrative. And so that's what I'm really most interested in. And so what I'm going to do today is talk about 3 cities, Seattle, Vancouver, and Victoria. I'm going to lean a little bit more into Seattle because I know that will be less familiar to most of the people in the audience. I'll lean into Vancouver and then not so much into Victoria, just because I know most of the people in the audience will be more familiar with the Victoria context. But what I really want to do is set these 3 cities against each other because they have some really striking similarities, not just in the sense that they all exist in Coast Salish territories, but that their urban processes of development had very similar stories in many ways, despite some really profound differences that I'll get into as well. And so I'd like to start with, again, that acknowledgement of the Coast Salish territories and really try to have us think about breaking down that international boundary and to think about this as a single space that includes the 3 cities that I'm talking about, as a single interconnected space through kinship, through trade, through all kinds of relations. And so Vancouver, Seattle, and Victoria are really not that far apart in the broader scheme of things, even though certainly as a scholar, I was trained in the American tradition, which meant I learned nothing about Canada until it was relevant to my dissertation. And the reverse is often true as well. These are treated as somewhat separate spaces, but I really want us to push back against that today. One of the ideas that one of the images that I use a lot to get at some of the ideas I'll be talking about today is this image of, it's called American Progress. It's a painting by a man called John Gast from the 1870s. It's a very common image from the late 19th century. It was wildly popular in its day, and it purports to show the narrative of North American history. And the figure in the center is a white woman, the spirit of progress, and she's drifting west across the plains carrying a school book in the English language and trailing telegraph wire behind her. And ahead of her, you can see Indigenous people kind of disappearing into the darkness. And around her, the stages of so-called civilization, the wagon train, miners, the stagecoach, the plow, the railroad. And then in the light of the rising sun is the avatar of progress. It's the city. And this is the way that Indigenous and urban histories are usually talked about in both popular culture and in academic scholarship until recently. Is that when urban history begins, Indigenous history ends. Never the twain shall meet. They are mutually exclusive. And what I've tried to do in my work is really push back against that, and really think about the ways in which urban and Indigenous histories are actually mutually constitutive. They create each other in conversation, including in those moments where people claim that they have nothing to do with each other. That is perhaps the moment in which they have the most to do with each other. And so this is kind of an image that I teach with a lot. I think it's very much an American image, but I think it speaks as well to the sort of Canadian story of urban development and Indigenous history, that the two are antithetical to each other. So what I'd like to do then is dive into Seattle's history a little bit, and then Vancouver, then Victoria, and then we'll work our way back out to Seattle. So oh, hold on, gonna hit the right button here. First, though, I want to just say a couple things about some of the language I'll be using. And there are sort of two poles that, as a scholar, as a writer, as a teacher, I try to kind of oscillate in between. One is the pole of settler colonialism. And I know for a lot of you, I recognize some of the names coming into the room. I know some of you know these terms very, very well, and others may not. So I just wanted to sort of define them a little bit. So settler colonialism really attempts to recreate European societies in new places. And in doing so, it requires the elimination of the so-called native. And that can be legally, that can be physically through violence, and so on. And often settler colonialism inspires settlers to find ways to, quote, become native, to become local to that place. And that's something I'm very interested in. What does it mean when people say they belong somewhere? How do they do that? How does that work? And what effect does that have when newcomers to a place say, this is now ours? How does that actually work? And then the really important point to make sure that we're on the same page about is that this is an ongoing process that continues today. This isn't something that happened in the past. It is still with us today. It is the system in which we all find ourselves. And so thinking about the past is a way to understand the moment that we're in right now, and also where our futures might go. So settler colonialism is at one end of the spectrum for me in my thinking. The other is survivance. And this is a relatively new term that was coined by an Ojibwe writer named Gerald Visner. And he was really trying to get at something that was more than just survival or victimhood, but something that spoke to really resistance and creative adaptation. And so I really try to think about settler colonialism as one pole of things, survivance as the other pole, and trying to figure out the balance of those two things in the stories that we tell. We don't want to tell stories that only focus on settler colonialism, because then Indigenous peoples seem primarily like victims and passive victims of that history. If we focus only on survivance, though, then colonialism doesn't sound so bad. And so it's really a matter of sort of oscillating between the two, using evidence and concrete examples. And that's what I'm hoping to do today. And because in urban places in particular, survivance has often been rendered really invisible. And I'll give you some examples of that. So I want to take us first to the southern part of the Salish Sea, to Seattle. This is the man after whom Seattle is named, Siat. That's one anglicized way to spell his name there. He died in 1864, and during treaty negotiations in 1855, he gave a speech, or is said to have given a speech, in which he talked about his people disappearing from the land. And this new sort of change of worlds that was coming. That was a phrase that he used. And that his people would remain as ghosts to haunt the people of, for example, the city named after him, that would be named after him. And I start my Seattle book by really talking about this as a ghost story, that this is a haunting, because we also know that he made speeches during the treaty negotiations where he said very pointed things to the effect of, watch these new people. They're not trustworthy. Watch them. Keep an eye on them. Not, we're going to all disappear and haunt you. But that's the story that got picked up by settlers, was the story of haunting. And that has become kind of the famous Chief Seattle speech that you may have heard of. And it's not clear whether he made that speech or not. It was first written down in the 1880s in English. But he's sort of the central figure of Seattle's historical consciousness in many ways, even though he didn't live very long to see much of the city develop. But his presence in the city really spoke to a reality that urban settlements in the Northwest only existed because of Indigenous presence. And so we can look at something like this, for example. This is the Battle of Seattle. It's a map drawn by a naval officer. So what you're looking at here is what is now Pioneer Square in Seattle, if you know that neighborhood, the old neighborhood of Seattle. And what you're looking at is an island that's sort of attached to the mainland and to wooded forest bluffs with a little bit of a tidal bay behind it. And this is the Battle of Seattle in 1856, when Indigenous activists and warriors attacked Seattle in the wake of pretty disastrous treaty negotiations. So it was a place that was sort of really on the edge of Indigenous territory, but it was also embedded within Indigenous territory. And one of the ways you can see that is if you look at the sort of the bottom of the image, there are some little, they almost look like trees, and it says Tecumseh's Camp. This is actually an encampment of local Duwamish people who were living in the town of Seattle, and who did not participate in the violence. They were from other tribal communities. And this is the reality of early Seattle, is that it only existed because of Indigenous labor and Indigenous presence. This is the sawmill cookhouse. Henry Yesler's sawmill was kind of the economic engine of early Seattle's history, the first 10 years or so. And this was the cookhouse with some of the Indigenous workers in front of the cookhouse. And virtually every aspect of economic life in Seattle's early history involved Indigenous people, whether it was getting food, bringing the mail, taking care of children, clearing land, working in the sawmill, and so on. And so it was really clear in Seattle's history, and this is true all around the Northwest, where the Indigenous labor makes these settlements really stick. They would have failed had it not been for Indigenous presence and Indigenous, in many ways, hospitality. But one of the things that becomes really clear in Seattle's early history, when it first incorporates in 1865, one of its first rules, first ordinances, is that Indigenous people cannot live within the city limits unless they are employed by white people. So there's a tension there, because they're saying we don't want these people here, but we sure do need them. And so there's this real tension, and that speaks to the centrality of Indigenous people in the early years of these settlements, that the first laws that are being passed have to do with their presence in this place. The reality is that Indigenous people were pushed out in Seattle. And the reality, too, is that doesn't leave a lot of record in the archives. There are, over time, increasingly an increasingly few number of Indigenous places within the city as the urban fabric kind of builds. This is one of the places where Indigenous people were still allowed to be. It was called Ballast Island. It's in exactly what it sounds like. It was a pile of ballast on the shore of the city. And these are probably Duwamish canoes at Ballast Island and an encampment there. And this is where Duwamish people came in 1893, when the last remaining longhouses in Seattle were burnt down in West Seattle, just across from downtown. And the people came here, and there was a lot of newspaper coverage, but it's one of the only real documented examples of the destruction of all the villages that were in and around what is now Seattle. Most of those happened sort of off the radar archivally. So it can be very tricky to sort of track who did what when. Even in the oral tradition that I found, that I worked with the tribes that I worked with, there wasn't a lot of specific information about when a particular village was destroyed or whatever, except for the one in 1893. It was called Herring's House. And it was burnt down by a real estate company, so land developers. And that seems to be the pattern from what we can see in the archive. But probably the biggest thing to be thinking about in this story of urban colonialism is landscape change and large-scale urban development projects, and that's certainly true in Seattle. So Indigenous people, even though there was a treaty in the 1850s that, suggested that people were all going to move to the reservations further away and so on, there were still Indigenous people living in traditional places within the Seattle urban fabric well into the 20th century. One of those people was this man, Huelchtid, Salmon Bay Charlie. This is now the Ballard neighborhood of Seattle in the northwest of the city. And this is his home. You can see his canoe around 1905. And then this is his home. This is that same place 10 years later. This is the construction of the Hiram M. Chittenden locks, which connected Puget Sound to Lake Union and then to Lake Washington. And this was very much a modernist scheme. The idea was to rationalize nature, to improve nature, and I'll say more about that kind of thinking in a little bit. But it dug straight into the traditional ancestral community of Welchtide's people, which was called Shilshul. Tucked away inside was the village that was on this site. That was essentially eradicated entirely by this construction in 1915. And this had widespread effects on the ecosystem of the city. So this is at the other end of the ship canal. This is what's called the Montlake Cut. This is where Lake Union, which is in the foreground, became connected with Lake Washington, which is in the background. And you can see there's a significant water level difference in them. When this cut was blown through and the Lake Washington began to drain, one of the rivers that drained out of Lake Washington, the Black River, ceased to exist in the course of an afternoon. So this is a postcard of it when it was still flowing, and then a picture of the river after the lake dropped. And this was where most Duwamish people were still living in the 19 teens. They were still living along this river. They were fishing along it. This was a place of sustenance and of community. And there are oral traditions that speak to white settlers coming down into the riverbed and picking up salmon in gunny sacks and having a big sort of celebration of the destruction of this river. And of course, for the Duwamish people, it was a devastating transformation of their landscape. So these large urban development projects could have really profound effects on watersheds, and in doing so, have profound effects on Indigenous people. So what that meant is that by the early 20th century, you have scenes like this, the Smith Tower, which was the tallest building west of the Mississippi for some time. And within sight of this tower, there were Indigenous people starving to death on the Duwamish River, which was being straightened at the time. So there's this tension between Indigenous survival in the city and this kind of modern city that there seems not to be any space for Indigenous people in, at least as Indigenous people. So we'll come back to that. We'll come back to the Seattle story in a few minutes just after this. The one other dynamic I would say that I find really interesting and that is a parallel between all three cities is the ways in which Seattle has consistently sold itself using Indigenous imagery. The Seattle Seahawks logo is a great example of that. But this is Seattle's first piece of public art. It was erected in 1899. It's a replica of it still stands in Pioneer Square today. And it was erected to sort of commemorate the Klondike Gold Rush, which really put Seattle on the map. And it's kind of a claim on Seattle's Northern Empire. What it is a mortuary pole that from a Tlingit community, the community of Tongass, and it was torn down or sawed down. The human remains in it were discarded, and it was towed back to Seattle, and then erected in the city as sort of pointing northwest as kind of a stake on their claim to empire. And so this new sort of Northwest Coast totem pole kind of imagery begins to overlay local Indigenous forms of art, for example. Like as I'll say later, you don't really see Coast Salish style art in the city as public art until much, much later. It gets kind of overlaid with these totem poles that aren't actually from the place. So Vancouver has, in some ways, a very parallel story, not just that they both had big fires in 1886 that burned down the whole place. That's one sort of parallel that they have. But they have parallels in other ways. And that is the sense that there was no space for Indigenous people in a modern city. And that's the kind of the narrative or the ideology that really is manifesting in both these cities. There is one sizable difference or important difference between Vancouver and Seattle. In Vancouver's case, there are actually Indian reserves within the urban fabric. That is not the case in Seattle. There was supposed to be a reservation in what is now the Duwamish Valley of Seattle, but that was rejected. But Vancouver is different in that there are reserves within the urban fabric, and the most well-known of those, of course, is the Kitsilano Reserve, or the historic ancestral community of Sanok. And this is that community in 1900. It's a well-known image. but by the early 20th century, and this is where the cities continue to sort of be in conversation with each other, there's a really growing discourse of sort of ecological hygiene that becomes kind of the justification, I guess, to say, for the removal of Indigenous people from urban spaces. Sometimes it's done in a kind of paternalistic way. We're doing this for their benefit. They need to be away from the ills of civilization. But often the language has everything to do with hygiene, with aesthetics, and with the sense that nature would be better without these people in it. We can order nature our way now, and there's no place for Indigenous people in that story. And so in the case of Sanok, the residents of Sanok were moved in 1913 to the North Shore of Burrard Inlet, and the reserve was largely liquidated. And we'll come back to that story later. And so what's interesting to me is that in the Lake Washington Ship Canal was 1915. The liquidation of Sanok was 1913. And as we'll see in Victoria, it's the same time period that is really key in the story of urban colonialism in these three cities. This is Kitsilano Point, 1932, and the sort of lifestyle, the beach lifestyle of Vancouver, the taking the air, taking the waters, and so on, is very much founded. That kind of outdoorsy Vancouver lifestyle is very much founded on Indigenous dispossession. There goes my lights. And that is not to say that Indigenous people were not still in the city. In later periods. This is Stanley Park in the early 20th century. There were Indigenous communities, as those of you who have read Jean Barman's work know, the book Stanley Park's Secret. There were Indigenous families living in the park into the 1930s. And here there's a discourse not just of hygiene or orderliness or whatever, but there's also a discourse of wilderness, of nature that is empty of people. And that's a narrative that I think we've kind of inherited when we talk about places like Stanley Park. Seattle and Vancouver both are cities that they're the only cities in the world that people move to get closer to nature. And that has something to do, I think, with the dispossession of Indigenous people from a place that then gets kind of reinterpreted as wilderness. And then similarly to Seattle, Vancouver has this kind of overlay, the sort of the totem pole factor as well, where it begins to sell itself using images of Indigenous people or images purported to be of Indigenous people and traditions as a way to kind of market itself. But it often does that as a form of overlay over the local story. The local Indigenous reality gets kind of overlaid with these totem poles from elsewhere, which are not often intended for Indigenous audiences at all. It's a way for a city to market itself. And so that brings us to Victoria, and this is a story that I'll just spend a little bit of time on because I know most of you will know the broad outlines of this story. And that's the story of the Songhees village on the waterway that was there for a very, very, very long time, obviously, and was still there into the late 19th and into the early 20th century. There's been some good research done about the long negotiations that, 50 years almost of negotiations that led to the eventual removal of this reserve in 1911. That the Indigenous community of Songhees actively fought that process for a very long time, and that's a very complicated story that I don't have all the details on. But that the expulsion or the removal of this reserve happened in 1911. So it's that same decade, it's the 19 teens that we need to be really thinking about. And this is something I want us to think about for museums is our periodization. Do we focus on the sort of the pre-contact period and then pick up the really modern period of Indigenous resurgence and so on? Do we lose the middle bit? And if so, what is it about the 1910s? The narratives of modernity, the narratives of progress, the narratives of environmentalism that make Indigenous dispossession possible. There's something about that decade. And that's in places with treaties, it's in places without treaties, it's in places where there are reserves, where there are not reserves. It's the same story in many ways. There's something about that decade that I still am sort of trying to figure out. What is it about that period that makes Indigenous disappearance seem like a self-fulfilling prophecy? And it is the low point of Indigenous population. And so there is this belief that Indigenous people are going to just disappear somehow. But there are other narratives as well. And one of those is the narrative of environmentalism, that we're going to make nature more orderly and more hygienic and more aesthetically pleasing and so on. And one of the ways we're going to do that is by removing Indigenous people. And Victoria, of course, has its own history with totem poles and images from further away and so on that become layered onto the landscape and start to become civic symbols in their own right. So I want to work my way then more into the present, and then from Victoria back to Vancouver and then back to Seattle. So one of the things that I'm really interested in are the ways in which histories are not finished. That there's such a powerful cultural narrative, I think, in settler society that Indigenous history is always disappearing, that it's always coming to an end. And what I really love about some of what's happening in these three cities is it proves that that's a lie. And so a really good example of this in Victoria is the Signs of Lekwungen project, and to sort of reclaim these sites and sort of stand in the face of disappearance, really. So at the Place of Cradles and at the Royal British Columbia Museum, these spindle whorls are ways for Songhees people to sort of reclaim and re-emerge in these spaces. And re-emergence might be a good word for how we think of some of this. Similarly, the Songhees Nation marine tours that they've been planning are ways to actually get bodies back on the water and on the land. And so this is a way for the city to sort of almost turn itself inside out in a way, to say that Indigenous history has not ended here, that all these narratives of modernity and progress and so on have turned out to be false. Have turned out to only benefit some people. But here are the first people coming back to reclaim these spaces and to do so with a lot of agency. Vancouver, again, is a city that has really sold itself for a very long time using Indigenous images. And I find that Olympic events are always really great opportunities to see how a city sells itself and thinks of itself, that sense of place that Denise was talking about earlier. And so the four welcoming figures at the opening ceremonies of the Winter Games, I had students who were among the group of dancers there, and it was interesting having conversations with them about their feelings about participating in this, both feeling really proud to be part of this event and to be able to showcase their dancing and their regalia and so on, but also feeling like they were being put to a purpose. And the purpose was for Vancouver to say, look at what a progressive city we are. And then the reality is, of course, that the four host First Nations that had a relationship with the Olympics, that was a new thing. And that's really important to not downplay or discount that. But it's also a part of a longer history of a city marketing itself. And that's the exact thing that many activists and community members pointed out during the Olympic Games, during protests and so on, particularly drawing attention to the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. To say there's a veneer here that needs to be pulled away, that there is a presence in this city of colonial violence that is still ongoing. And so this events like the Olympics are really opportunities for us to think about those sort of tensions between how a city markets itself and how a city actually exists on the land in relationship to Indigenous peoples. And so one of the things that's been really interesting to watch in Vancouver and in the region more generally is the resurgence and reassertion of Coast Salish place protocols. And a really good example of this has to do with the totem poles that are in Stanley Park that have been there for some time now and are very much a tourist attraction. Is that now to approach those poles, you can't really approach them without being confronted by Coast Salish art. and Coast Salish presence. And that's in the case here of Susan Point's The People Amongst the People, these house posts that are very distinctively local and sort of speak back to this more generalized Northwest Coast style as a way of relocating, replacing those re-putting in place, I guess replacing is what I mean, those local symbols of place, those local symbols of meaning in a way that speaks back to the sort of urban marketing and the more regional images like totem poles and so on. And that brings us to Sanok, which is just a few blocks from where I live in Kitsilano. And this is the Squamish Nation's planned redevelopment of the reserve, what's left of the reserve there at the south end of the Burrard Bridge. It's a very ambitious program. It's been interesting watching local non-Indigenous residents, especially just off to the left of this image in Kitsilano Point, sort of levy claims that they were not consulted and so on. And so there's a certain irony in that particular kind of history and complaint. But this is really, in my experience, thinking about urban history and Indigenous histories in connection around the world, this is a pretty unique thing that's happening, this kind of development. And it's interesting that it's happening without treaties. It's happening in a very different way than would happen in Seattle, for example. There is nothing like this in Seattle. Even with treaties, there's nothing analogous to this at all. So this is a sort of enormous experiment in sovereignty in many ways, and an urban sovereignty in particular. So the buildings are just starting to go up now. There are big holes in the ground and cranes and so on, and it's really interesting to see this taking shape. And one of the things I meant to put a picture of this in is, but I forgot, is if you go to the construction site now, there are large signs in Squamish Snitcham, in the Squamish language, and they aren't translated into English at all. One of my students translated them for me, and they all say what you might expect them to say, please stay out. But they say that in the Squamish language. So this is really a significant symbolic development as well in that way, as a reclaiming of space. As a reclaiming of territory within the heart of the city in a way that's going to be impossible to ignore. This is another mock-up of what it might look like when it's finished. It's going to really change the neighborhood and really, I think, it's already provoking a lot of discussion, but I think it's really globally a significant moment for urban indigeneity to see something like this taking shape. And then if we work back down to Seattle, one of the interesting things about the way colonialism has played out in Seattle is that there are three kinds of Indigenous communities that exist in the city. One is the multi-ethnic urban Indigenous community with people from all over the place, from Vancouver Island and the Great Plains and the Southwest and so on. And then there are two local Indigenous communities. One is the Duwamish tribe, and these are the people on whose territory the city was built, but they are not federally recognized. They don't count as Indigenous people according to the federal government of the U.S. Because they are said by the government to not meet all 7 criteria that you have to meet to achieve federal recognition. And that's a very long, complicated story, but it all sort of boils down to that early 20th century landscape change that sort of broke those relationships with place among the Duwamish. Many of the Duwamish tribal members are the descendants of people like Chief Seattle, whose ancestors married into the white settler community. So that was one strategy of survivance, was to marry into the community, and people carry those stories. They know they're descended from particular Duwamish leaders and so on, but they don't currently have federal recognition. In contrast to that, there are federally recognized tribes like the Muckleshoot tribe, in whose territory I grew up and who I used to work for, who do have federal recognition. So, for example, they're allowed to fish on the Duwamish River and are co-managers of the fisheries, whereas the Duwamish are excluded from that. So you have two really different models. And I would say that the Duwamish have a lot of cultural authority in the city. A lot of people pay attention to them. They have the ear of the city in many ways, but they don't have any policy control. Whereas the Muckleshoot tribe and other federally recognized tribes have the legal authority in the city. So it's this kind of bifurcated thing that's very conflicted. There's a lot of animosity around this issue. It's really an unfortunate situation, but it comes down to the fact that Indigenous people in urban places sometimes bear greater burdens than Indigenous people in other places because of the nature of landscape change and so on. So Seattle's waterfront, if you've been there recently, has gone through a massive transformation. There used to be a big highway right along the waterfront that's been taken down. And there's a massive redevelopment now of the waterfront happening to make it a sort of a public space. And it's going to be filled with Coast Salish presence. So this is a piece that's currently being finished called Family by a Puyallup artist named Qualcius or Sean Peterson. And these are going to be welcoming figures, like those welcoming figures at the Olympics. These are going to be figures welcoming people into the city. There are going to be longhouse-like structures all along the waterfront that will sort of suggest what was there once in that same very place. And native plant gardens. And they're also going to be, they've also sort of broken up the seawall. So there are now a couple of small beaches to try to create that permeability between land and water again. And so all of these are ways to sort of replace, pun intended, I suppose, replace an urban landscape with an Indigenous landscape, or an indigenized landscape, maybe is a better way of saying it. And this is being done very much in concert with local tribes, mostly the federally recognized tribes. But it's sort of a repopulation of the local in this urban space. And one of the ways that that's happening is through place names. And so Elliott Way, which is one of the main streets along the waterfront, has been given its second name, Zidzalalich, which means the little crossing over place. And that's the name of the Indigenous community that was overlaid by that Battle of Seattle map. It had been on that little island. And so that place name is kind of coming back now into currency as a way to sort of acknowledge. It's like a land acknowledgement in a way, but tied to a really wholesale transformation of the watershed or the waterfront in a way that really acknowledges specifically Coast Salish stuff, Coast Salish histories, Coast Salish place names, and so on. That's not to say that this is an unalloyed triumph or anything. Many people in the Indigenous world of Seattle will point to this story to say, you know, things are not well yet. Things are not as they should be yet. So John T. Williams was a diddy dot carver, well known at the Pike Place Market. He was kind of a fixture of the market in many ways. And he was killed by a police officer in 2010. Most of us would say murdered by a police officer in 2010. And this is his memorial pole that was put up at the Seattle Center. And so just as during the Olympics, the activists pointing toward the missing and murdering Indigenous women and girls, this is also the community trying to speak up and say, this can't just all be about marketing. This has to be actually about social justice and human rights in the city for Indigenous people. But the thing that I find, I guess, really heartening and exciting about this region is the canoe journeys, is the way in which the region is kind of being woven back together across that international boundary. And so places like Vancouver and Victoria and Seattle are being kind of re-entangled back up together into a fabric, a Coast Salish fabric, and beyond as well. And so the first paddles to Seattle in 1999 saw a few dozen canoes coming to Seattle, and now it's thousands of people that make these journeys every year. Many of you, I'm sure, know about them, and some of you have probably participated in them. But this is a way for these urban spaces to actually be kind of rewoven back into the larger Coast Salish world. And so Muckleshoot, where I used to work, they hosted last year. And so there were dozens and dozens of canoes that came into the Seattle waterfront to be welcomed according to protocols. And so that's, you know, according to the logic of that American progress painting, this should never have happened. This should be impossible. Those Indigenous people should have disappeared off to stage left and never to be seen again. And yet here we are with the canoe journeys. And so, you know, it really is a way that this whole region is being sort of woven back together. And that's the thing that I find so powerful about these stories of urban survivance, is that they overturn really deeply held stories in settler colonial thinking about the disappearance of Indigenous people, the disappearance of indigeneity altogether. And it turns out that that's just simply not true. That's not what's happened at all. And these three places really clearly show that. So in terms of just some thoughts about museums, I didn't put a whole lot of thought into this because I'm curious about the conversation we might have. But just three thoughts that I had. One is that museums take place and I mean that literally, and that museums happen in particular places. They have their own histories as physical objects, and they take place within existing Indigenous landscapes and persisting Indigenous landscapes. And so museums can really investigate, I suppose, their own literal footprints and think about how they are, in fact, part of that story. They're not a place to tell the story, they are the story. And so that's what I mean when I say museums take place. I would also say that narratives and periodization matter. Again, these stories of Indigenous disappearance, which we've all seen those museums, you know, they're changing, but we've all been in those museums where Indigenous people are sort of in the first section and then you never see them again. That obviously is a problem. But often what I find is that you get the early period and then you get the very recent period represented in museums in terms of Indigenous peoples. And then the bit in the middle drops away. It's like in the Bay Area in San Francisco, you might see some reference to the Ohlone and other native peoples of that place and baskets and things like this. And then there's nothing until a bunch of folks take over Alcatraz in 1969. There's no sense of what happened in between there. And so I think museums need to really think hard about that middle story, the story of dispossession, and to really make that visible in a way that is appropriate and not disrespectful, but to actually sort of take charge of that story, take responsibility, I guess, for that story of dispossession. And then the last thing I'll say, just from my own experience, my first book has an atlas at the back of the book with 127 Indigenous place names in the city, Duwamish place names. And I have found that I know a lot of people who didn't read the book, but they love the atlas. And that atlas has had a lot of effect, particularly when it's been backed up by tribal support in getting things renamed in the city. And that's something that I see happening more and more around North America and elsewhere too, is that these place names are really powerful tools for re-embodying the landscape. Many of them are very descriptive. They tell us what was there in that place and maybe what is still there. And so I think museums can really make a lot of use of these traditional geographies where the communities in question are comfortable sharing that stuff, sharing that information. But I think museums can really play an important role in replacing, again, I keep using that pun, replacing themselves and the rest of us within these landscapes that are still active, still very much active. And that's, you know, I'll end just by saying that that's something that when I worked for the tribe in my hometown, again and again, I was so amazed at, you know, despite how much has been lost in the history of colonialism, how much has been retained as well. That these stories and these places are still there, they're still alive, they're still ready to be awakened, and sometimes never went to sleep in the first place. So those are just some thoughts I have based on the three cities. and some of the work that I've done mostly in Seattle, but as I've been in Vancouver now for almost 20 years, and so I've been kind of keeping my eye on how things are similar or different. And again, despite all the differences, treaties or no treaties, reserves or no reserves, the stories sure feel the same in many ways. And so I think there's something there to take away. So thanks very much, and I look forward to your questions.